In the heart of the Indian Ocean lies a small island with a long and proud history, Sri Lanka. Once known as Ceylon, it stood as a beacon of Buddhist civilization, artistic achievement, and political independence. But for over a century and a half, this land was bound by the chains of a foreign power, the British Empire. Beneath the romanticized tales of railways, tea, and the so-called gift of civilization, lies a far more sobering reality, one marked by conquest, extraction, and profound injustice. This is the untold story of the British Empire in Sri Lanka, a story of atrocities, resilience, and survival. The British assumed control of coastal Ceylon from the Dutch in 1796, and by 1815, had annexed the last sovereign kingdom, Kandy. The Kandyan Convention, signed with the island's nobility, pledged to uphold Buddhism and protect local customs. But these assurances were swiftly undermined. What followed was not benevolent governance, but a systematic imposition of colonial rule through military force, economic exploitation, and cultural suppression. In 1818, the people of Uva-Wellassa rose in defiance, not in rebellion, but in defense of sovereignty, dignity, and tradition. This movement, now known as the Uva-Wellassa Liberation Struggle, was led by noblemen, such as Keppetipola Disawe, who initially served under the British, but later turned against colonial authority to join the people's cause. The British response was one of calculated devastation. Under Governor Robert Brownrigg, a scorched earth policy was unleashed. Entire villages were razed, ancient tanks and irrigation systems were dismantled, and the region's agricultural base was obliterated. Crops were burned, livestock were slaughtered, fruit-bearing trees were felled. The destruction was not tactical, it was punitive. Tens of thousands of Sinhalese men, women, and children were affected. The British response to the Uva-Wellassa Liberation Struggle involved extreme violence, including the systematic killing of a significant portion of the adult male population. Women and children were left to survive in a barren, broken land, a landscape reduced to ash and starvation by imperial vengeance. It was, by all accounts, a campaign of extermination, and though the term genocide did not exist at the time, the atrocities committed during the Uva-Wellassa campaign bear its unmistakable mark. Keppetipola was eventually captured. In the days before his execution, he conducted himself with serene dignity. He requested Buddhist rites, spent his final hours in meditation, and forgave his captors. When the moment came, he faced death without fear. His skull was taken to Britain and displayed as a colonial trophy, only to be returned to Sri Lanka more than a century later, where it now rests as a symbol of patriotism and sacrifice. 3 decades later, unrest stirred once more. Burdened by exploitative taxes and deepening injustice, the people of Matale rose in a determined struggle for liberation. Leaders such as Veera, Puran, Appu, and Gongalegoda Banda launched daring strikes against British institutions, seeking to reclaim sovereignty and restore dignity to their people. The colonial response was swift and unforgiving. Veera Puran Appu, captured and sentenced to death, faced the firing squad with his head held high. Tradition holds that, in his final moments, he declared, "If there had been half a dozen such men as me to lead this nation, there would not be a single white man living in the Kandyan province." He fell not in defeat, but as a symbol of the enduring struggle for freedom. Gongalegoda Banda was exiled. Though the struggle was suppressed, it kindled a spirit of resistance, one that would not easily be extinguished. Through the Wastelands Ordinance, vast tracts of ancestral land were seized under the guise of development. These lands were handed to British planters for coffee, and later tea, while countless locals were dispossessed. To meet labor demands, Tamil workers were brought from India, a move that laid the groundwork for future divisions. These workers endured deplorable conditions. Overworked, underfed, and without rights, they toiled in what can only be described as indentured servitude. Despite assurances in the Kandyan Convention, the colonial administration marginalized Buddhism. Monastic institutions decayed, and missionary schools became dominant. Sinhala and Tamil education systems were sidelined in favor of English. The British crafted a new elite, Western-educated, anglicized, and detached from their cultural roots, to serve colonial interests. Colonial rule was underpinned by racial hierarchy. British officials monopolized governance and commerce. Locals were excluded from power, and public institutions remained segregated. Racism was not merely a social ill, it was policy. Forests were cleared to make way for plantations. Wildlife was hunted to the brink. Ancient irrigation networks, the pride of Lankan civilization, were left to ruin. The ecological consequences continue to echo into the present. Even nature was not spared. The elephant, a revered creature in Lankan culture, became a target for sport. British officers and planters hunted them by the thousands, not for sustenance or necessity, but for amusement. Major Thomas Rogers alone is said to have killed over 1,400 elephants. Others followed suit. Entire herds were wiped out. The loss to biodiversity and to cultural heritage was incalculable. Human-elephant conflict today is in part a legacy of this colonial violence. In 1856, Major Rogers was struck by lightning at the Haputtali rest house, an event many locals saw as divine justice. Legend holds that his grave was struck multiple times thereafter, and even memorials in his honor were not spared. In the mists of Haputtali, some believe that nature remembers. Though the language of war crimes did not exist in the 19th century, the actions carried out by the British in Sri Lanka meet the standard. Collective punishment, mass executions, scorched earth campaigns, these were not anomalies, they were policy. During the 1818 liberation struggle, civilians were starved, homes were razed, and sacred sites desecrated. In 1848, protesters were shot and leaders executed without trial. The British left behind more than railways and tea estates. They left behind fractured communities, economic dependency, and institutions designed for control, ethnic tension, class inequality, and cultural alienation. These are part of the colonial legacy. The wounds are not just physical, but psychological, the product of a system built on hierarchy, erasure, and silence. But not all was silence. Brave sons and daughters of Sri Lanka rose up. From Keppetipola Disawe and Veera Puran Appu to Gongalegoda Banda, voices of resistance challenged colonial domination. Leaders like Kumaratunga Munidasa, Sir Ponnambalam Arunachalam, and MC Siddhi Lebe played vital roles in the cultural, educational, and political awakening of the nation, advocating for unity, reform, and progress. A cultural revival began. Movements to revive Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islamic education, along with the rise of national newspapers and the resurgence of Sinhala and Tamil languages, became acts of defiance. Together, these efforts, across communities and beliefs, planted the seeds of independence. Sri Lanka achieved independence in 1948. But true freedom demands truth. The stories of those who resisted, and those who suffered, must not be forgotten. We must remember not to harbor hate, but to seek justice, to learn, to reflect, and to ensure that such injustice never again takes root. The empire did not civilize. It conquered, extracted, and erased. And this is the truth of British rule in Sri Lanka. This is our story.